The wind was screaming across the plains that night, a wild and furious voice that rattled every window and shuddered against the wooden bones of Jake Turner's cabin. He had weathered storms before, dust, drought, thunder that split the skies in two, but there was something restless about this one, like the land itself was remembering old wounds. Jake sat at his table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, listening to the hammer of rain on the roof. He was a man who had grown used to silence, who had built his life on solitude and suspicion. The frontier had taught him long ago that trust was a dangerous luxury. So when the faintest knock reached through the howl of the wind, his first instinct was to ignore it. No one came calling at night in these parts, not unless they were bringing trouble. The knock came again, more desperate this time, and against his better judgment, Jake rose. The door creaked as he pulled it open, and for a moment, the storm seemed to step inside with all its fury. But it wasn't the weather that stole his breath, it was the figure standing on his porch. A woman, her skin bronzed by the desert sun though now pale from exhaustion, stood trembling with a small boy in her arms. Her black hair was plastered to her face, her clothing torn and soaked through. But it was her eyes that held him, the depth of fear in them, tempered by a desperate strength. The boy clung to her, his wide eyes reflecting the flicker of lightning. Jake's hand tightened on the doorframe, his instincts screaming to turn her away. She was Apache. And out here, that meant danger. Settlers whispered of raids, of blades in the night, of families torn apart. Bringing her inside was an invitation to ruin. But then Jake saw the crimson stains spreading down her arm, the ragged wound hidden beneath her sleeve, and his resolve wavered. She shifted the boy against her chest and spoke, her voice nearly lost beneath the storm. "One night," she pleaded, the words trembling as though each carried a weight too heavy to bear. For a long moment he did nothing, his thoughts clashing like thunder. He had built his life on keeping others out, on trusting no one. To open his door to her was to risk more than his cattle or his land. It was to risk being marked a traitor in the eyes of his neighbors. Yet when the child reached out a tiny, shaking hand toward him, Jake felt something break loose inside his chest. Against every instinct carved into him by years of hardship, he stepped aside. She hesitated, disbelief flickering in her gaze, before crossing the threshold. Rain traced silver lines down her bruised cheek as she entered the cabin. The warmth of the fire greeted them, a fragile refuge from the storm. Jake shut the door firmly, turning the lock with a sharp click. For a heartbeat, the silence inside seemed even louder than the storm outside. The woman lowered her son to the ground, his bare feet pattering softly on the wooden floor. He looked around with wide-eyed wonder, the shelves stacked with worn books, the sturdy table, the rifle mounted high above the mantel. Jake, watching from a cautious distance, noticed how tightly she held the boy's hand, her protective grip trembling not from fear but from pure exhaustion. He motioned toward the chair near the fire. His voice, rough from disuse, carried a gruff edge. "Sit." She obeyed without protest, lowering herself slowly as though every muscle ached. The child curled against her. The flames painted their faces in shades of gold, warming their damp skin, thawing the chill from their bones. Jake disappeared into the small kitchen and returned with a basin of water and a clean cloth. He crouched beside her, his movements careful, unthreatening. She flinched when his shadow fell across her but didn't pull away. Wordlessly, he dipped the cloth and held it out. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting instant, gratitude softened the hardness of her expression. She took the rag gently and pressed it to her wound, her hands steady despite the pain. The boy nestled closer against her, comforted by the steady beat of her heart. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the cabin was hushed, just the hiss of rain, the occasional crack of thunder, and the low crackle of burning logs. Something unspoken lingered in that silence. A fragile connection, tenuous as a thread of smoke, wove itself between them. Two strangers on opposite sides of a world scarred by blood and mistrust, yet bound for a moment by need, by decency, by the faintest spark of trust. Jake busied himself with small tasks to hide the unease in his chest, though he found his gaze drawn again and again to the weary mother and her child. He had not chosen this. He had not asked for it. Yet, deep down, Jake knew that by opening his door on that storm-soaked night, his life had already begun to change in ways he could not yet see. The door gave a long groan as Jake pulled it shut against the weight of the storm, the wooden latch clicking into place with finality. For a moment he kept his hand there, palm pressed to the rough grain, as though holding back more than the wind. Behind him, the woman stood still, clutching her child so close her knuckles had gone pale. Her wide eyes darted across the single-room cabin, searching the corners like a fox unsure if it had stumbled into shelter or a snare. Jake didn't speak. His face was carved with lines of weariness, hard to read, the sort of expression men wore when they'd lived too long with solitude and danger. He gave a short nod toward the hearth. The fire glowed low, licking at the last of the pine logs. For a moment she didn't move, her body stiff, torn between instinct and exhaustion. Then, with a slow exhale, she crossed the room. Her steps were measured, cautious, carrying the invisible burden of years spent with reason to mistrust. She lowered herself by the fire, drawing her son against her chest, and released a trembling breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside her lungs for too long. Jake's hand hovered near the back of a chair, where a wool blanket hung. Without a word he carried it to her side and set it down gently, not close enough to startle but near enough for her to reach. The boy stirred, dark lashes lifting, eyes wide as he took in the cabin. They reflected the glow of the fire, and when they flicked toward Jake, they carried the wary curiosity of someone too young to understand fear yet old enough to feel its shadow. His small hand clutched his mother's sleeve as though it was the only thread holding him to safety. Jake bent slightly, careful not to close the space between them too quickly. His voice came out rough from disuse, but steady. "You're safe here," he said. Whether she caught the meaning or not, he couldn't tell. Her gaze lifted to his, meeting it just long enough to reveal something between suspicion and fragile hope. Her lips parted as if she wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, she gave the faintest nod, her body still trembling from cold and exhaustion. The night dragged on, the sound of the rain dulling from thunderous sheets to a steady dripping against the roof. Inside, the air settled heavy with unspoken questions. Jake busied himself with tasks that barely needed doing, stirring the coals, setting a pot on the stove, cutting through a hardened loaf of bread. He poured bitter coffee into tin cups, the steam rising into the stillness, and placed one and a slice of bread before her. She looked at the offering for a moment before murmuring something in her own tongue. Jake didn't understand the words, yet he felt them land, soft and sincere. He only gave a short nod in return, settling into the chair opposite with his own cup. The woman wrapped her arms around the boy as she bandaged a cut across her shoulder with practiced hands. Her movements were steady, not those of someone unfamiliar with pain. Jake kept his silence, letting the rhythm of the fire fill the gaps. He'd learned on the frontier that people spoke only when they could afford to. Pressing her now would be useless, maybe even dangerous. Still, unease tugged at him. Men in town had been restless lately, bitterness brewing over stolen herds, broken treaties, whispers of raids. One word about an Apache woman taking shelter beneath his roof, and it wouldn't be long before trouble came riding. He told himself this was just for tonight. By morning she'd be gone, leaving him to the solitude he knew. But as the firelight caught on her tired features, softening into the faintest smile as she looked down at her child, something shifted in him. Something he thought he'd buried a long time ago. The storm weakened to nothing, leaving the desert wrapped in an eerie hush. The fire dwindled to embers. She sat unmoving in the chair, eyes closed, her arms a protective cradle around her son. There was strength in her even in that weariness, a kind of resilience carved not from choice but necessity. It stirred something inside Jake he didn't want to name. He turned away at last, retreating to his bed, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay staring at the rafters, the silence of the desert pressing in, his heart beating slow but uneasy. Somewhere out there, beyond the stillness, he felt the shape of coming danger. He could sense it as surely as the steady rhythm in his chest. And deep down he knew, this night had already changed the course of his life. The fire cracked softly, its glow casting restless shadows across the cabin walls, and Jake Turner focused on the small tasks of the night to keep his eyes from straying too long toward the figure curled near the flames. He busied himself with a pot of stew, stirring slow and steady, letting the familiar smell of seasoned meat and vegetables rise and wrap the room in something that almost resembled comfort. It was a comfort neither of them trusted. When the food was ready, he set a bowl in front of the woman and another in front of the boy at her side. His movements were deliberate, careful, the quiet motions of a man who understood that suddenness could frighten. At first she made no move. Her gaze slid toward him, dark eyes filled with doubt, searching for cruelty or trickery in the calm lines of his face. But there was nothing there except the steady quiet of someone who had made the uneasy choice to open his door to strangers. After a long silence, she lifted the spoon and touched it to her child's lips first. The boy ate greedily, hunger sharpening every motion, and something deep in Jake's chest twisted as he watched. Only once her son was satisfied did she take a bite herself, her hand trembling as if eating at peace was an unfamiliar act. When she finally spoke, her words were low, her voice fragile but steady enough to cross the divide between them. "No trouble," she murmured in halting English. "Only rest." Jake nodded slowly, questions burning behind his eyes but kept unspoken. He wanted to ask who had driven her to his door, who had placed the fresh wound on her shoulder, who had left her wandering the desert with a boy clinging to her side. But none of those questions left his mouth. He only gave her the words that felt right. "You're safe here. Tonight, nobody will bother you." The sentence hung heavy in the air, its weight more than either of them could measure. The boy, belly warmed by food, curled close to his mother and slipped into sleep. She smoothed his hair back, her face softening in the dim light, and Jake, for the first time, saw not the stranger, not the Apache the world told him to distrust, but simply a mother, worn thin by fear and love, guarding what mattered most. As night stretched deeper, Jake sat across the room sharpening his knife. The scrape of stone on steel was steady, filling the silence, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew kindness carried its own kind of danger. Word traveled quickly, and if it reached the wrong men that he had taken in someone like her, blood would surely follow. Yet the thought of sending her away was heavier than the risk of keeping her here. Looking at her, at the faint thread of trust flickering in her eyes, Jake knew his choice was already made. When the pale edge of dawn broke across the desert, spilling light into the cabin, the woman stirred, tense and ready to flee. Then she saw him, standing by the window with a tin cup of coffee in hand. He turned slightly and their eyes met. Something passed between them, unspoken, fragile, binding. He didn't smile, but his gaze held a softness absent the night before. The boy awoke soon after, chasing slivers of sunlight across the floor, his laughter bright against the cabin's walls. For a moment, it felt almost ordinary, as if they were not divided by fear, blood, and history. But that moment shattered the instant Jake caught sight of movement on the horizon. Riders. 4, maybe 5, cutting sharp shapes against the rising sun. His jaw set, and he reached for his rifle, the muscles in his shoulders tightening with the certainty that safety had ended. "You stay inside," he told her quietly, the firmness in his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Don't make a sound." Her eyes widened, fear spilling clear in them, her hands pulling her child close. She understood all too well what was coming. The steady drumbeat of hooves grew louder, danger rushing near. Jake stepped outside, rifle in hand, posture steady and hard, every inch the cowboy the men from town knew him to be. Inside, though, a storm churned. To shield her would mean a fight. To turn her away would mean condemning her to a fate he could not stomach. The men reined in their horses, dust rising as they dismounted. Familiar faces, cold and sharp, men who had never once seen an Apache as anything but an enemy. One of them spat into the dirt and tipped his hat with mockery twisting his grin. "Mornin', Turner," the man drawled. "Word is you've got company." His eyes flicked toward the cabin, sharp as a knife. Jake tightened his grip on the rifle, his gaze fixed hard on the man, silence pressing down like the desert heat. Inside, the woman clutched her son, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought they might hear it. She didn't know if Jake's kindness ended with the night he had offered them shelter, didn't know if he would hand them over now to keep himself safe. But then his voice broke the stillness, low and steady, carrying more weight than the rifle in his hand. "Ain't nobody here but me." And in that moment she understood. Whatever came next, blood, danger, or a fight that neither could win, Jake Turner had made his choice.